So, how exactly did a young Macedonian king manage to carve out an empire stretching across Europe, Asia, and Africa in just 10 years? Today, we're diving into this explainer to trace the absolute relentless momentum of a man history immortalized as Alexander the Great. We're going to track a campaign that literally reshaped the ancient world, permanently linking three distinct continents and, honestly, altering the course of human history forever.
To really wrap our heads around the impossible odds of this story, we have to look at the numbers. Alexander was just 20 years old when he took the throne after his father was assassinated. Think about that for a second. At 20, he's suddenly leading a kingdom, and almost immediately after, he's staring down the absolute superpower of the age, the Persian Empire. At the Battle of Issus alone, this young guy faced a Persian army estimated at up to 100,000 men. It was a literal David and Goliath situation. But, as we're going to see, Alexander brought some overwhelming advantages of his own to the battlefield.
Here's our roadmap. 1. The Macedonian springboard. 2. Conquering the Persian Empire. 3. Crowned pharaoh in Egypt. 4. To the edge of the world. And finally, 5. A fractured three-continent legacy.
All right, let's start at the beginning with Section 1, the Macedonian springboard. Alexander didn't exactly start from scratch. He inherited this incredibly formidable, newly unified Greek military machine from his dad, King Philip II.
And what's really fascinating is how one specific weapon innovation totally changed the game. Before Philip and Alexander came along, your standard Greek spear was about 8 feet long. But the Macedonians introduced the sarissa, a massive 18-foot pike. Now imagine highly trained professional soldiers forming up 16 ranks deep into a tightly packed formation called a phalanx. What they created was basically a solid wall of iron spear tips. It was like a giant human porcupine that was virtually unstoppable if you tried to hit it head-on.
The crucial takeaway here is the stark contrast between these two forces. On one hand, you've got the highly disciplined, heavily armored Macedonian infantry working together as a single, unstoppable machine. On the other hand, the Persian forces were massively numerous, sure, but because they were drawn from provinces all over a vast empire, they were incredibly variably equipped. They leaned really heavily on their excellent cavalry and on hired Greek mercenaries who were still stuck using those older, much shorter 8-foot spears. That technological and tactical mismatch, that was the engine powering Alexander's entire conquest.
Moving right along to Section 2, conquering the Persian Empire. By the spring of 334 BC, Alexander had secured his army and crossed the Hellespont, bringing the fight directly to Asia.
His completely fearless, and some might even say totally reckless leadership style was obvious from day one in his first major clash in Asia, the Battle of the Granicus. Facing a steep riverbank guarded by Persian cavalry, Alexander didn't hesitate. He led this immediate, headlong, almost blood-rage charge straight across the water. He was actually fighting hand-to-hand for his life in the thick of it. His helmet was literally split open by an enemy sword. But this wasn't just blind rage. He was deliberately pulling the enemy's focus, buying precious time so his heavy infantry could cross the river behind him. Once that phalanx made it across, the Persian lines just shattered.
And this fearless energy was matched perfectly by his absolute tactical genius. Fast forward a bit to the decisive Battle of Gaugamela. Even though he was outnumbered, perhaps 2-1 by King Darius III, Alexander executed this legendary, incredibly risky trap. First, he drifts his forces out to the right, which forces the Persians to stretch their massive line just to keep up. Then, when Darius unleashed his terrifying scythed chariots, Alexander's ultra-disciplined infantry simply opened up lanes and let the chariots roll right through, completely harmlessly. Finally, with the Persian center all stretched out and weakened, Alexander formed his elite companion cavalry into a wedge and charged straight into the gap, making a beeline directly for King Darius himself. The Persian king fled, and just like that, the empire broke.
Which brings us to Section 3, crowned pharaoh in Egypt. You see, Alexander knew that true conquest isn't just about breaking things, it requires strategic cultural integration.
His campaign across Africa is just mind-blowing. First, to protect his supply lines back home, he had to take out the mighty Persian navy. How? By conquering all their naval bases by land, carrying out some truly brutal, terrifying sieges at island fortresses like Tyre. But once the Mediterranean coast was clear, he practically just waltzed right into Egypt. The Egyptians deeply resented Persian rule, so they welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The ancient priests in Memphis literally crowned him pharaoh, handing over the royal treasury without spilling a drop of blood. He founded the enduring city of Alexandria, and deep in the desert at the Siwa Oracle, he was actually hailed as the son of Amun, the king of the gods. He essentially elevated himself from a mortal Greek king to a living god in the eyes of the locals.
Now for Section 4, to the edge of the world. Because when Alexander returned to Asia and pushed deeper into the Persian heartlands, things began to take a much darker, much more exhausting turn.
As he pushed further east, you really see his attitudes start to shift. Early on, he wanted to look like the legitimate, respectful successor to the Persian kings. But in 330 BC, he made the call to torch Persepolis. This was the magnificent, shining, ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, and Alexander ordered his men to pillage it and burn it to the ground. He framed this as long-awaited payback for the Persian invasion of Greece and the burning of Athens well over a century earlier in 480 BC. So the mask was slipping. He was no longer just a liberator, he was a conqueror, exacting vengeance.
And the immense stress of this endless war really began to rot the army from the inside out. His men were exhausted. They were also deeply offended because Alexander started adopting these decadent Persian customs that they felt were incredibly un-Greek. This cultural friction sparked massive paranoia within Alexander's inner circle. It got so bad that when a plot against his life was uncovered, he ruthlessly executed his own cavalry commander, Philotas. And it didn't stop there. He immediately sent assassins to murder Philotas's father, Parmenion, who was Alexander's most loyal, capable veteran general, just to make sure Parmenion couldn't seek revenge. The whole Macedonian court had turned into this deadly, paranoid machine.
Eventually, that machine just ground to a halt. We get to the river Hyphasis in modern-day India. It's been 8 unrelenting years. They've marched thousands of miles across brutal deserts and freezing mountains, and now they're hearing these terrifying rumors of gigantic Indian armies waiting across the river, complete with massive war elephants. The Macedonian troops just broke. They mutinied. They flat out refused to take another step east. The sheer scale of this intercontinental ambition had finally broken the army's spirit, and a furious, deeply reluctant Alexander was forced to turn back, right when he thought he was nearing the very edge of the world.
After a disastrous, grueling desert retreat, he finally made his way back to Babylon. Which brings us to our final act, Section 5, a fractured three-continent legacy.
32. Let that sink in for a moment. That is the staggeringly young age at which Alexander suddenly died of a mysterious fever in Babylon. He died completely undefeated in battle. He was the master of the known world. But because his death was so sudden, and he was so young, he left behind a massive, devastating power vacuum.
Just think about the timeline of his life. The sheer speed of it is staggering. From invading Asia in 334 BC to dying in 323 BC, it's barely a decade. And because he left absolutely zero plans for succession, reportedly just whispering on his deathbed that his empire should go to the strongest, everything immediately descended into chaos. His veteran generals turned on each other almost instantly, violently carving up his vast territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa, in what became known as the Wars of the Successors. Even Alexander's own family, including his young son, were murdered in the crossfire.
But you know, the ultimate takeaway of this whole explainer isn't really the military conquest, or even that immediate political collapse. It's the dawn of the Hellenistic Age. Alexander's conquests permanently linked 3 distinct continents. Greek soldiers, merchants, and scholars just flooded into Asia and Africa, blending Greek thought, language, and architecture with these deep, ancient local traditions in Persia, Egypt, and India. This incredible cultural collision sparked massive leaps forward in art, science, and governance. Those fractured successor kingdoms, despite being born in total chaos, they endured for centuries, profoundly shaping the ancient world right up until they were finally swallowed by the rising power of Rome.
So, as we wrap things up today, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We've seen the brilliance, the paranoia, the unparalleled victories, and the staggering loss of human life it took to forge this empire. Was the immense cost of a decade of relentless bloodshed actually worth the vibrant 3-continent cultural legacy he left behind?
This marble bust captures Alexander's calculating intellect. His success relied on applied military engineering. He used the structural mechanics of massed infantry to solve numerical disadvantages. This abstract diagram represents the Macedonian army as an interdependent system of combined arms. Different units operate as specialized cogs within a single machine. The sole tactical objective of this system is to execute a localized fracture, opening a path for a direct strike against the enemy command structure. To understand how this works, we have to deconstruct the first principles and individual components of this machine. Then we can test that machine against the real-world asymmetric threats Alexander solved at Issus and Gaugamela. You cannot grasp the tactical logic of the commander until you isolate and examine the specific tools at his disposal. The foundation of the army relies on 9,000 professional Macedonian phalangonites. This 3D isometric model isolates a single phalanx block. Its function is to act as the anvil. It is designed to fix the enemy line in place. The physical structure achieves this through sheer density, packing soldiers 16 ranks deep. The men wield the sarissa, an 18-foot pike. This length allows multiple rows to extend past the front rank, creating an impenetrable wall. But the cost of this density is extreme rigidity. The formation cannot easily turn, leaving exposed flanks highly vulnerable to attack. Observe the rigid, overlapping nature of these heavy infantry formations on this stone relief. The forward posture locks the soldiers into a single directional mass. The phalanx is an unstoppable physical force from the front, but structurally fatal if left exposed on its sides. To solve that vulnerability, Alexander deployed 3,000 elite hypaspists, or shield bearers, armed with shorter spears. These units act as flexible joints. They guard the vulnerable edges and maintain the integrity of the line as the rigid core shifts across the battlefield. With the center secured, the primary offensive component is positioned on the far right wing, the 1,800 companion cavalry. This is the Hammer. Led by Alexander himself, they are high-speed shock troops designed to strike directly at structural vulnerabilities. Notice the movement contrast, the slow, grinding push of the infantry anvil, paired with the rapid, sweeping strike of the cavalry hammer. The Macedonian machine works entirely in tandem. Fix the enemy, protect the joints, and finally strike. We observe this machine under stress at Issus in 333 BC. This tactical map highlights the restrictive boundaries between the Nore Mountains and the sea. Alexander utilized this choke point as a force multiplier, compressing the Persian ranks and neutralizing their numerical advantage. But the system nearly failed. While crossing the river, the central Macedonian phalanx lost its tight formation and began ceding ground to Greek mercenaries in the Persian center. To prevent collapse, Alexander executed a bailout maneuver. He completely abandoned his engagement on the right wing and drove his cavalry in a sharp diagonal strike toward the center. This ancient mosaic captures the result. The diagonal strike specifically targeted the Persian king, Darius. The threat forced the king to flee in his royal chariot, causing his entire command structure to disintegrate. At Issus, strict geographical constraints created an environment where the combined arms system survived its own internal friction long enough to deliver the hammer blow. 2 years later at Gaugamela, the terrain was entirely different. Switching to this wide-open tactical grid, we see a vast open plain that the Persians had flattened specifically to deploy their war chariots. Alexander neutralized the chariots using specialized light infantry, the Agrianes, to eliminate the crews, while the heavy phalanx simply opened internal lanes, allowing the horses to pass harmlessly through the formation. With the chariots cleared, Alexander executed a counterintuitive maneuver. His entire line drifted right, marching laterally away from the center to physically stretch the enemy. To prevent being flanked, the Persian line mirrored the movement. They shifted right to match the Macedonians, inadvertently thinning their own center. The tension mounted until a fatal structural gap tore open in the overstretched Persian line. The companion cavalry instantly pivoted, driving directly through this newly created gap, straight toward the king. At Gaugamela, Alexander manipulated the battlefield geometry itself, engineering the conditions for a structural failure in the Persian line. Viewing Issus and Gaugamela simultaneously on this split screen, a universal pattern emerges. But notice the left wings. Parmenions' infantry anvil endures immense pressure, absorbing casualties and holding the line just long enough to buy time for the decisive strike. The core of Alexander's doctrine relies on a single truth. A massive army's cohesion is entirely dependent on its central command node. Forcing the commander to flee causes an instant systemic fracture across the entire enemy force. Once that structure breaks, their numerical superiority becomes useless. The ultimate goal of the Macedonian system was rarely the total physical annihilation of the enemy. It was targeted, psychological decapitation. The glamorous cavalry charge only works because the infantry absorbed the overwhelming brunt of the enemy mass. With the terrain and enemy forces removed, the Macedonian army stands revealed as an interlocking geometric structure, operating in supreme synchronization. Alexander proved that an engineered system of combined arms could routinely isolate and dismantle sheer mass. Looking across the vast ruins of Persepolis, you see the physical scale of the territories this machine managed to dismantle. While the political empire fractured without its architect, these mechanical principles established the blueprint for combined arms tactics that defined the Mediterranean warfare for centuries.